Can you imagine going 40 years without a good tomato? When you're wandering in the wilderness, there is no time for gardening, friends. I want to dig in a little bit here because even though the language here in the NRSV is translated as tempted, the better translation here in Luke is tested. He will absolutely surrender himself to the grace, mercy, and love of God. He will do all these things, but it won't be like this. It won't be because he is giving into an invitation to idolatry, to worshiping somebody, not God, to being somebody he is not. So indeed, if you were listening during the children's sermon, you know where the sermon's going. If you weren't, because you're still trying to wake up, you are forgiven. I get it. But this season of Lent, and these readings in particular, help us get to this question of identity. And identity is a big word these days. Sometimes it's a little fraught. And it's because identity is at the heart of who we are, right? It's the heart of how we understand ourselves. And so that's why the word identity and all the various ways it's used these days can be pretty intense, right? And it's for good reason. Because the identity speaks to the core of our very being. The core of our very being. Well, we hear about identity in this gorgeous passage from Deuteronomy. It's really a liturgy of gratitude. And I want you to imagine with me what it'd be like to live out this liturgy. We start by remembering who we are because of whose we are, and partly whose we are is God's, and partly also whose we are is in this gorgeous series. The tenses and the pronouns change so fast in this. If there are any English or linguistic majors in the room, you probably caught it too, right? It starts with third person. A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor, right? He. Third person, right? He was my ancestor. And he went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number. And then he became a great nation, mighty and populous. And when the Egyptians treated us, did you catch that twist? Suddenly he becomes us. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and oppressed us, we, again, first person plural, we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice, saw our affliction, our toil, and God rescued us. God brought us out of Egypt. Now, if this is happening after 40 years wandering in the wilderness, it's probably not this individual, right? Because the whole point of that 40 years was to get to a generation that hadn't been in Egypt and hadn't been even in the wilderness that time. God kind of wanted to start fresh, right? Only a couple who were at the beginning of the journey end up there at the end. But the identity is still wound up in who we are being part of whose we are. And then there's this great shift. So God brought us into this place and gave us this land. And so now he, us, I bring the first fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. Now imagine what that's like. 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Okay, real life, right? Did y'all notice that the strawberry stand at the corner of El Camino Real and San Diego Road is open again? Yes, strawberries are back in season. And they're also selling tomatoes grown locally that were not picked green somewhere far away, treated with chemicals, and put on an airplane or a truck and shipped here. Right? The first tomatoes of the season. Can you imagine going 40 years without a good tomato? When you're wandering in the wilderness, there is no time for gardening, friends, right? You're wandering. You're not anywhere long enough to plant and harvest the first fruits of the first crop after all that wandering. The first fruits I give to you, O Lord. this beautiful liturgy of gratitude, the heart of identity, who we are, tied in deeply with whose we are. And the gospel this morning. We always hear a version of this story, right? We always hear one of the evangelist version of Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, not surprisingly, I'm going to take issue with the translation. You could have predicted that because it's me. And I want to dig in a little bit here because even though the language here in the NRSV is translated as tempted, and even though you heard it in the collect and you'll hear it again in the proper preface at communion, the better translation here in Luke is tested. Tested. And it also helps to realize if we can keep stripping away 2,000 years of Christian culture and accretions, kind of like barnacles on the side of a boat, right? We attach these things and then we assume they've always been there. So if we take away temptation and make it go back to testing, and we also take this character of the devil, and we take 2,000 years of accretions off of that character, we don't have the incarnation of everything that is evil and broken and bad in the world. That idea came a lot later. In Jesus' time, and in the time when the first audiences would have heard this story, Hasatan is something very different. Hasatan is more like the code enforcement officer of heaven. He's there to check things out, make sure things are the way they're supposed to be. Go back to Job, right? You might read Job during Lent. That would be a good Lenten practice. Job, remember, in the Council of the Gods, Hasatan says, really, are they all that faithful? And God says, well, consider my servant Job. You never want God to say that, by the way. And so Hasatan goes and tests Job. This is very similar. And this test is uniquely designed for Jesus right now. Because if you go back to this text, check, feel free to look in your bulletin. I won't think that you're, reading the New York Times on your phone or doing Wordle. Go back and look at the beginning. It says, after his baptism. This story happens immediately after his baptism. And what is the last thing we hear about his baptism? What does the Spirit say to Jesus? Right, you are my son, the beloved. It's all about identity, right? Who Jesus is. You are my son, my beloved. With you I am well pleased. And it's right then that the Spirit throws him, doesn't lead him, that's so genteel, throws him, ekbalo, like ballistics, throws him into the wilderness for this testing. And it's like Hasatan has come along to just check him out. Make sure he gets it. Make sure he answers the questions right as the Son of God, the beloved Son of God. And the tests that he takes him through are perfectly designed for him, and they're not unfair. I mean, think about the life and ministry of Jesus side by side with these tests. Command this stone to become a loaf of bread. If, not really if, another translation problem, since you are the Son of God. The devil's not arguing whether or not Jesus is the Son of God. Since you're the Son of God, command these stones to be bread. Well, Jesus will feed multitudes, right? It's not like he won't do that in some miraculous way, but it's not going to be because of this character over here tells him to, right? Here are all the kingdoms of the world. It can all be yours if you worship me. Well, won't Jesus roll out the reign of God? But it will look unlike any other reign. It'll be a reign of love and grace and mercy and compassion. And then he takes them to the top of the temple and says, okay, since you're the Son of God, you know what that psalm is, the psalm we just chanted? Since you're the Son of God, throw yourself and let God save you. Well, he will do that, won't he? on the cross. He will absolutely surrender himself to the grace, mercy, and love of God. He will do all these things, but it won't be like this. It won't be because he is giving into an invitation to idolatry, to worshiping somebody, not God, to being somebody he is not. He'll do it because he's being true to his identity, who he is, because he is the Son of God. And so whatever you chose to do this Lent to mark this season, even if you're still trying to decide, that's okay. It's all right if you're still trying to figure out what will make this season meaningful for you. Whatever it is, may it be something that reminds you of your deepest identity, who you are as a beloved child of God, that helps you see that belovedness in the beloved children of God around you, that reminds you who you are. And most importantly, whose you are.